So, uh, this is where we left off last. Any questions about anything before we start? All good? Alright, so, let's see. So, as I said, we ended last time with industrial consolidation, which had a number of business practices here: economy of scale, just early mass production, vertical integration, which is what Carnegie did, where you have not just the production, but everything leading up to that, and oftentimes even the shipping to other, like to the markets. So we have here where he worked with Henry Clay Frick to get access to cheap coal so that he could keep making steel at a major profit. And we'll talk more about this later. Horizontal integration, basically a monopoly, buying up your competitors or consolidating with enough competitors that you can just starve the other ones out of business. That was a Rockefeller thing. And we'll get into how he managed to avoid technically being a monopoly, because again, it was, at least on the books, illegal. So we'll get to that. So the trust, as I said, was basically where he had Standard Oil and split the company. Typically it was by state, because as long as you're not crossing state lines, it's not a federal thing. And technically, big air quotes, each Standard Oil of whatever state was their own company, but they all still answered to Rockefeller. They sat on the board of trustees, and yeah, that's the whole thing. And then, of course, folks were well aware of the inordinate power these big businesses were wielding. All right. We have a little more consolidation. The book here mentions telegraph industry also using horizontal integration. We have, let's see, Western Union got most of the federal telegraph contracts during the Civil War. So the way telegraphs typically worked, at least as far as their spread, is they would build their lines alongside railroad tracks. And so anytime there was like a railroad depot or any sort of station where the train would stop, they would just put a telegraph office there. So when they moved west and you now had access to pretty fast, relatively safe travel, you also had access to usually Western Union telegraph lines, but it was a lot faster than sending a letter through the mail and hoping it gets where it's supposed to go. Let's see. 76,000 miles of telegraph lines by 1861. Stock went from 3 million to 41 million by 69. Cornelius Vanderbilt got involved. This is where he made his money. Jay Gould also tried to get in, but it took until 1881. He merged Western Union and American Union Telegraph Company, made $30 million in the process, and the next day, the New York Tribune reported, "The country finds itself this morning at the feet of a telegraphic monopoly," because, again, they were aware of what was going on. This wasn't some, thing happening in the shadows that nobody noticed. And the thing about these big monopolies is they can charge whatever they want. There's no way to compete when your competitor is in control of, at least in the case of Carnegie, or not Carnegie, Rockefeller, 4/5 of the market, you can't compete with that because they can drop prices until you starve, and then bring prices back up to whatever they feel like. I mentioned that it's sort of like what we have today with like not telegraph, telephone, cable, and internet providers, because they use their own physical wires. They're essentially region locked. Like you have certain parts of the country that are controlled by regional monopolies. Because you can't open like a mom and pop internet store because you'd have to run your own lines, and it would just be a whole mess. So yeah, this is still pretty relevant. And a big part of all of this consolidation had to do with bankers. We have John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. I don't remember if they're a bank or just like a financial agency, whatever that means. He was an investment banker in the 1850s, had his own investment firm by 1861. He was one of the folks that helped to bring money in from Great Britain to invest in the various things happening out west. Let's see. He refinanced a number of ailing railroads, and whenever he did this, he would always put his men on the boards of directors. Morning, y'all. Let's see. That's almost everybody. He put his people on the board of directors, which meant that he still had ties to these companies, which also meant he got a little bit of income from all of them. And by a little bit, I mean more than he'd ever need. But, he helped Carnegie merge with several competing companies in 1901 to create United States Steel, which was the world's largest corporation at the time. Worth $1.4 billion, which this is $1.4 billion in 1910 money. By 1910, Morgan had investment in 340 directors, 112 corporations, and was worth $22 billion, which in at least 2012 money was worth about $608 billion, and will be even more today. So yeah, J.P. Morgan was filthy rich, quite literally in many cases. And he never actually created anything. He just helped to merge other people's companies and got quite a bit of money out of that. So we have the telegraph lines. Again, you can kind of see the pattern of running along the major railroads. Don't have a whole lot going on here in the South yet. What year was this? I don't remember if it says. Revised May 1977. Yeah, that's not right. Oh wait, no, it shows Hawaii. So this is weirdly recent, huh? Anyway, a quote from Vanderbilt here. You have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you. Because when these men felt slighted, they would do their best to destroy one another. Again, we're probably not going to be able to get into that part of the little documentary, considering how much time we've missed thanks to the weather. But there is this thing between Vanderbilt and Rockefeller, and how they were at each other's throats for most of their careers. Here we have Jay Gould. just saying what all these rich fucks think. I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. That's how they feel about people that they see as below them. It's like, oh, everything runs on money, and I've got the money. I can make them do whatever I want. Here we have J.P. Morgan. Man generally has two reasons for doing a thing: one that sounds good, and the real one. And again, sometimes they didn't even bother with one that sounded good. They knew they could get away with whatever they wanted. It was a heck of a time in history that it surely is not relevant at all today. Rich people do whatever they want and don't get away with it. J.P. Morgan, gold is money, everything else is credit, which is technically true. I believe I've mentioned in here, like paper money, coins I guess less so, but paper money, it's worthless. The paper isn't worth anything. It's literally a banknote. It is a piece of paper that says that you have access to that value of money in gold in a vault somewhere. And that, as long as the government exists, is worth something. But at the end of the day, gold is where the actual money is. And again, if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, gold is just like a shiny bit of metal. Why is that worth anything? But whatever, I don't know. I'm not a billionaire. So, when it comes to corporations, yes. The most common form of business was a partnership, because with partnerships, or the reason they moved from that, and that wasn't just like two guys working together in a business. It could be a half dozen more or more. But once one of them died, the partnership was dissolved, and therefore whatever venture they were doing would essentially go away, or they would have a bloodbath fighting over it. Usually not literally, but sometimes literally. So a corporation allowed for limited liability, which meant that if you invested $500 into whatever the corporation was, and the corporation disappeared the next day, just completely went bankrupt and dissolved into nothing, you'd lose your $500, but the banks wouldn't be coming after you to pay for the rest of what that corporation was worth. Because in a partnership, when it went down, you and the rest of the partners had to essentially pay back whatever that thing was owed. And you had people losing their entire livelihoods over stuff like that. So with this, at least, because of the structure, you only risked what you invested. And also, as we said here, it had a perpetual life system where it didn't matter if one of the first people that created the business dies, it's going to keep running. Which meant that for investors, there was more stability, which meant more people were interested in putting money in. So not only were the people who were putting the money in safer from just having everything taken away, but that also meant that more people were willing to put more money into these things, which caused them to explode in size and number really, really quickly. So I did get ahead of myself with the trust thing. So again, technically monopolies were illegal. Technically, one company owning the entire an entire industry was illegal because it completely destroyed any kind of competition. And as I said, when you have businesses that don't have competition, they can charge whatever the hell they want. And they can, their product can be as shoddy as they want. It doesn't matter if there's no alternative, they can do whatever they please. So the trust, as I mentioned, where he split up his company, technically, regionally, but each person who ran these individual companies would sit on a board of trustees, which Rockefeller himself ran. So it's monopoly by another name. And he wasn't even real subtle about it. Like today, we still do have a lot of that where, for example, if you look into who's behind all the various, say, brands of food in the grocery store, it ends up being like 3 companies, but they just split the name and have different, quote, brands under them, but it's still just one huge corporation. Rockefeller didn't bother with that. His company was Standard Oil, and he created Standard Oil Pennsylvania, Standard Oil New Jersey, that sort of thing, where you just had his company, but in that state. And then they all sat, as I said, on the board of trustees, which was run by Rockefeller anyway. Also, and this is a fun thing, this is before Citizens United, which made corporations just have basically unlimited power in the government. In 1886, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations were protected as people by the 14th Amendment. So the amendment that had originally been put into place to make the recently freed African Americans into citizens was now being used to protect corporations from government regulations, like how many work hours in a day. So rather than protect the people, the workers, the government was protecting the corporations from the workers. And again, this is before Citizens United, which was in the last couple of decades. It basically said that a corporation can spend as much money on political campaigns as they feel like, which essentially means now that corporations just buy campaigns. If they weren't running the government before, they sure as hell are now. Technically, we had the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 that put all these principles that were already in place into a single document, but then almost immediately after, there was the Sugar Trust, which, so again, it was just a sugar version of what Rockefeller's doing. It was ruled as a state activity, therefore the Sherman Antitrust Act could do nothing with it, because again, if it's a state thing and not a federal thing, the federal government technically can't get into it. So we have the Sherman Antitrust Act that's supposed to make this not possible, and then immediately after, there was this court ruling that said, oh, well, trusts are state things, so we can't be involved. So this act was completely pointless. We have another weird image here of Standard Oil basically getting into every part of society because, again, they had so much money and wielded so much power, especially with this 14th Amendment thing, that they were in charge of far more than oil. Speaking of trusts, or, monopolies, we have the Railroad Trust, which this is a whole thing we'll get more into a little bit later. But basically, there were smaller railroad companies that were trying to compete with the big railroad companies. And in order to make this possible, there was a commission put in place that made it so that big companies couldn't I got ahead of myself. What was going on was the big train companies were giving the big corporations vouchers, essentially, which is to say cheaper costs for shipping. So the big companies that had all the money were paying less money than the smaller businesses. So they were choking out the smaller businesses. So this commission was put in place to prevent that. And within like a decade, all the people on the commission were replaced with people who were in charge of these big railroad companies. And so now this commission was being used for the opposite and strangled all the little small shipping companies. So yeah, that's just from this image. We'll talk more about that in the notes later. But yeah, again, just the rich folk were running everything. What a surprise. So while we had all this going on, the book says that the most important innovation for this era was managerial specialists, which, if that's kind of made your eyes glaze over, I get it. It's talking about middle managers. Accountants, traffic managers, marketing executives, all this really boring white-collar crap. But it was necessary because these corporations were getting so big that they couldn't be run by a single man or even like a board of directors. We needed literally hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people working in the mid-system of that between the higher-ups and the regular workers to keep everything running smoothly. So this is where you get all those stupid titles like senior executive, member of production, or whatever. Yeah, so that's what all this was. And again, not super interesting. It's not as interesting as like, oh yeah, by the way, these rich dudes were just running the freaking country. But this was so necessary for running those huge corporations. They were getting really unwieldy. Also, we had Frederick W. Taylor develop the principles of scientific management. They basically calculated how quickly a person could do a task. Again, we weren't quite at assembly line yet, but we're in that vein where people are working alongside machines and doing a thing and then moving it down the line. But what that meant was whoever was able to do these tasks fastest, that was now the standard. And everyone was expected to do that task at that speed. Not at all preparing for the fact that people are different and people get tired. And when you're running people 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, trying to maintain the same pace as these literal machines they're working with, that's going to lead to a lot of people getting hurt. Another big part of all of this were retail outlets. Before this, when you wanted to go buy food or whatever, you'd go to what would today be the local farmers market. Like that was because everyone who produced was a farmer, and you just would meet and sell your stuff. But with this huge industrial output, they needed places to actually sell things that were more centralized. So we have these department stores cropping up in major U.S. cities, like Macy's in New York. That was one of the first big department stores, at least in America. Staffed by sale clerks. Consumers could find cheaper products at places like Frank W. Worth's 5 and cent stores. Then you had chain supermarkets, Great American and Pacific Tea Company. So even people who were living in the cities, which were well away from the farms, could get their hands on at least canned fruits and vegetables, which like today is but like back then that was the best you could do. I mean, you can't can't send this stuff into a city and have it distributed and maintain any level of freshness. So canning was the way to go. And also meat from the various meat packing plants, which we'll also get into in greater detail, particularly in the Progressive era. And then for those that lived outside the cities, there were mail order catalogs and rural, I always have a hard time with that word, free delivery, because even though, again, as I said, like the people living in more, rural areas, typically would go to like the local farmer's market, but now they also had access to this industrial market. They could order, canned stuff, and as I'll show you guys here in a minute, just about everything. So real quick, we have an image of just your typical street in a city. The little streetcars make me think of San Francisco, but it's not nearly as hilly as San Francisco would be. So this could be just any other city. Rail cars were real common. San Francisco is just one of the few that kept them around. Also, you may notice that while we have this rail car here, there's also a horse-drawn rail car right beside it. So again, there was this sort of era of flux. The creation of rail cars didn't just immediately mean that the horses disappeared. So this is an image of the front of a Sears, Roebuck & Co. Essentially mail order catalog. This is the same one in the book, I believe. No, not quite. The one in the book is number 108. This is number 110. The one in the book also is better color graded than this. This one's seen better days. But you could order just about anything out of these catalogs. I was mentioning to my other class, if you ever played like Red Dead Redemption and you go into the store and they just hand you this catalog. It's like, oh, pick out what you want to buy rather than like looking at it on the shelf. It was literally like that. You could buy whatever you wanted from these catalogs and they would send them to you. Food, of course, clothes, guns. Once cars became a thing, you could order an entire car, but not fully built. You had to kind of put it together yourself. Very, very IKEA in the way that was done. And even, again, those of you that may be familiar with at least Red Dead Redemption 2, even an entire house. They would send you the lumber, which was usually pre-cut, all the necessary tools and nails, and you could build your own house from what you could get from a Sears catalog. It was kind of nuts. All right. So the reason that all this industrialization happened so quickly was due to the traditional ideas of America. This idea that hard work and diligence resulted in success. So if you succeeded, you were seen as, literally morally superior, which is immediately going to become a problem. So upward mobility was not just desirable because, hey, you have more money and you could afford more stuff, but it was seen as proof that you were morally righteous and diligent and hardworking and all, the American dream crap, which was bolstered by churches, schools, intellectuals, popular writers, who all extolled these virtues. And again, this goes back to, I believe I mentioned this last semester for those of you that were here, this goes back to the Puritans. This goes back to the Puritans' ideal of predestination, essentially. where if you're successful, it's not because you necessarily were just better at what you were doing, it's because you were already predestined to go to heaven, and any success you have in this life is God showing you favor. Therefore, those that succeeded were seen as, again, essentially morally superior. Businesses consider competition in the market to be positive, even though they did their best to destroy said competition. Because, it's nice to say, oh yeah, a free, healthy market, while meanwhile trying to destroy said free, healthy market, because you don't want people making money if you could make more money. And also, these free markets tended to rely on government assistance, and also various protections. We'll talk more about that next chapter, with corporations and how workers were treated, and the rise of unions, etc. Because the government wasn't going to take care of the people had to take care of themselves. Of course, this was hardly overlooked, because while the wealthy were getting wealthier, those at the bottom while they were typically working in these factories, making some amount of money, the disparity was getting worse and worse. So there was quite a bit of criticism being aimed at this, which we'll get more into in just a second here. So while the popular culture of it was, if you're successful, then you deserve to be, regardless of how you became successful, no matter how many lives you destroyed to get there. Oh, well, it's all part of how it works. Not everybody was on board with that. Obviously, businessmen would justify themselves as best they could. They very much like to use Adam Smith's idea of the laissez-faire, which came from his 1776 book, Wealth of Nations. Basically, laissez-faire means let things alone. That the market should be left alone, and due to everyone working for their own prosperity, things would balance themselves out. He also described the invisible hand, which is essentially supply and demand. If there's a demand for a product and not a lot of supply, the price is going to go up because the products are going to be more valuable. If supply is able to meet demand, prices will regulate, and people will be able to afford what they need, presumably. And if demand drops and there's a ton of supply, the prices of those things are going to plummet as well, because nobody really wants them. And if you've got a warehouse full of, Furbies or whatever, and nobody wants them, then you're going to try to get rid of them for as cheaply as possible. As we said, this success was seen as something moral. School children are raised to believe this. We had Russell Conwell, pastor of the Grace Baptist Church in Philadelphia, printed a sermon entitled Acres of Diamonds. Acres of Diamonds. He said, I say that you ought to get rich, and it is your duty to get rich. And he proceeded to get rich by going around and giving this sermon and being paid apparently pretty handsomely for giving this sermon. This feels very televangelist. But that's for another day. And so, as I kind of alluded to, if those that were making lots of money were seen as morally superior, those that were destitute were seen as, well, they were somehow inferior. It was their fault that they were poor and starving. It was seen as a lack of merit. And the British philosopher Herbert Spencer, in his book Social Status, was sort of a theory of social evolution. He said that humankind was constantly moving towards perfection, and those at the top were morally superior. Which, again, real problematic. This was also around the time of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which discussed adaptation in biology, which we'll get more into later as well. And this sort of this sounded enough like what Herbert Spencer was writing, that they were combined into an idea of social Darwinism, which again is just that the strong survive, even if the strong, again, strong here, ruin as many people's lives as possible to get there. Needless to say, very few people would get the sort of wealth that Carnegie had. But due to this mindset, this cultural, just the way the culture was, it was believed that any amount of, if you worked hard, you could one day be as rich as Carnegie. You could one day, own the world's largest corporation. And that has been the whole American dream thing for literally centuries, is, oh, well, if you work hard, you'll be fine. Even if, the people at the top are rigging the system against everyone but themselves. But, Now, while they use Adam Smith as an example of, oh, well, we should just leave the market alone, he also wrote, the oppression of the poor must establish a monopoly of the rich. Profit or income inequality are always highest in the countries which are going fastest to ruin, which is to say, the cause of poverty is the greed of the few at the top, which eventually results in economic instability and oftentimes the destruction of empires. I believe that's actually one of the next quotes. No, the next one's from Conwell. Money is power. Every good man and woman ought to strive for power, to do with it, and to do good with it when ordained. I say, get rich, get rich. Yeah, great guy here, Conwell. Spencer, because English philosophers were just like this. The ultimate result of shielding men from the effects of folly is to fill the world with fools, which is to say, let the poor starve. That always tends to be where most British philosopher talking points end, is things will be better if we just let the poor starve because then we'll have less poor to deal with. And when they talk about the poor, they're typically meaning the Irish. But poor in England too, it's like, oh, let them starve. It's their fault they're starving. Certainly not everything else that's going on. And again, the whole survival of the fittest thing is not about strength or intellect, but indeed adaptation, response to change. Because, if you just look back at the fossil record, you had eras of history prehistory, where you had these really, really complex organisms. Dinosaurs are always a good example. They were really specialized in what they were doing. And then everything goes tits up and they all die. Except for, say, sharks and crocodilians and turtles and horseshoe crabs. The sorts of things that just had a real simple design, relatively speaking. And when things changed, they were able to just ride it out. So that's what this means, FYI. Okay. I was going to say, I didn't have the quote that I thought it had, because we're not done yet. So capitalists didn't want the government helping the poor because it would interfere with their system of free markets. There were some, such as Carnegie, that believed the wealthy should aid the poor. We have the Gospel of Wealth, where it said, a man who died wealthy died disgraced. Well, shame there's not more folks with that mindset. However, it's not to say that Carnegie was some great guy. He disliked charity, this idea of direct handouts to those in need, which is to say, helping people eat and get out of the freezing cold, etc. No, for him, he liked philanthropy, which was building institutions and building institutions that would raise educational and cultural standards, which is to say, building universities and libraries and slapping his name on the side of it. Because yes, having access to free libraries and back then pretty reasonably priced universities would allow one to do somewhat better in life, because having education is important, and we weren't really in the whole public school thing yet. But when you're starving, a library isn't going to help that much. So again, as I said, capitalists claim they supported the idea of laissez-faire, but in private and just their actions proved that they wanted to get rid of any kind of competition. Rockefeller stated, the day of individual competition in large affairs is passing on. Again, you're dealing with massive oil companies and steel companies and railroad companies and telegraph companies. You can't just decide to break into the market and make your own little shop on the side of the street. You can't do that. There's no way to break into that market, because these guys have set it up that way. They've got all the money. They're putting the money into politics to get laws passed and changed and whatnot to make it harder to get to where they are, because they're already at the top. Get to the top, pull up the ladder. That's how they always do. Now that said, while capitalists didn't want government involvement in their affairs, because, look, if we have regulations, we won't be able to make products as cheaply as we want and make the kind of profit that we want. They still very much brought in government help when it was good for them. For example, tariffs to protect against foreign goods, government troops to break strikes, and boy, they did that a lot. Grants and army assistance in building railroads and clearing bison and clearing Native Americans. Laws for property rights to protect businesses from workers. Yeah, so this whole idea of laissez-faire is kind of a sham. Because we can't have the government getting involved because we got to let business do what business does. But also government needs to get involved so that we're protected from our own workers that we're exploiting. Again, a quote from Carnegie here: "Cannot push anyone up the ladder unless he is willing to climb," which that's that whole, people are just lazy and don't want to work mindset. People don't want to work when they're starving to death, Carnegie. Or not that they don't want to work, you can't. You don't have the energy. You're more concerned about whether you're going to survive the day. Once you get people that rich, they don't see other people as equals anymore. Okay. Let's talk about some folks that opposed this. We have Lester Frank in his book Dynamic Sociology. He was not a fan of laissez-faire. He said that that society was the organization of happiness, and he opposed Spencer's beliefs that the government was just there to protect businesses. He said that the government's duty was to aid citizens. Richard T. Ely, I believe is how that's pronounced, in the labor movement, decries the social ills of massive businesses and enterprises, because, like, again, these people weren't blind. It's not like the big corporations were doing their thing and that was it. You had people starving in the streets. You had the poorhouses getting more and more packed with people as you had 2 or 3 dudes with all of the money. It's like, weird that the more people get rich, the more people end up poor. I don't know. We have Henry George and Edward Bellamy, with George stating, amid the greatest accumulation of wealth, men die of starvation. Again, as I said, you could literally just walk through a city and see that. He believed this was due to rent, costs accumulating on a single plot of land, which he saw as unearned increment. Rent's kind of a touchy subject because unlike where you say buy property, you're just paying money perpetually for living on a piece of land. So yeah, he believed that wasn't quite didn't quite work for people. Meanwhile, Bellamy wanted a strong central government where large-scale firms would be taken over and given to workers' collectives, which, if you're familiar with the next guy we're about to talk about, this may sound familiar. We have Karl Marx, who was far more radical than George and Bellamy. He wanted much the same as Bellamy, a strong central government, large-scale firms taken over, given to a workers' collective. However, he preferred that through a socialist, violent revolution, corrupt capitalists and the government will be overthrown entirely to create a classless paradise. So that was the idea on paper. So we have Ward here. Pessimism is the product of a hostile social state. The answer is the substitution of a friendly social state. If this can be done, it will disappear. Yeah, pessimism coming from the government that's supposed to be working for you is actively tearing you down because they're being run by corporations at this point. Here we have Henry George. What has destroyed every previous civilization has been the tendency of the unequal distribution of wealth and power. Again, as a historian, you do kind of see that. Roman Empire is a real good example, where wealth was concentrated in just a few people and everyone else was starving, and eventually that broke down. Edward Bellamy, primal principle of democracy is the worth and dignity of the individual, which again, using the whole laissez-faire, if you're doing well, you're morally superior to everyone else, that didn't quite gel with his concept of individual dignity being paramount, because there certainly wasn't a lot of that. And here we have Marx. He says, I laugh at the so-called practical people and their wisdom. If one wants to live like a beast, it could naturally do so, or it could naturally do, to turn its back on humanity's suffering and only care about its own pelf. Which is to say, big business tycoons that were only concerned about their well-being as opposed to all the people that were working for them and technically, by definition, like their responsibility. But, also, whoever put this together was glazing Marx a little much. Philosopher, you could argue that. Political economist, sure. Revolutionary, he wanted to be. I don't think he ever did any revolutions. And then we have prophet here, which, all right, that's going a little far. Okay. So, if you're familiar with this era of history, you may also be familiar with the term the Gilded Age, because that's what all this was. This was typified by wealthy, and especially those with recent wealth, that valued opulence over good taste. So, say coating everything in gold, or it's just gaudy crap. You don't need me to explain to you what gaudy is. This was coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, which originally was only applying to the very wealthy. Again, folks like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Jay Gould and Vanderbilt, etc. But it very quickly was applied to those in the upper middle class, who often would purchase well beyond their means in order to appear like they were wealthier than they actually were. Because it was no longer just making money and living a comfortable life, it was proving how wealthy you were. Even if, again, most of that was just gaudy, kitschy crap that would be expensive, but certainly not worth it. In this period, the role of women did expand somewhat. Obviously, becoming more prominent in the household. They attended social, cultural, and political gatherings, typically as groups of women. It wasn't that they were involved in everything. Let's see. Okay. Of course, though, this was very much limited to the whites of the era. Black Americans were underprivileged in the South, and any attempt at economic advancement was hindered by the politicians who set up racial segregation to just keep the black population impoverished and unable to exert their power, which we'll get into more detail in just a minute. I don't remember exactly when this was, because it's not something that is often taught in history, and it's not in this book. I think it was Tulsa, Oklahoma, so-called Black Wall Street, where groups of black business owners got together and created a pretty prosperous place to live and work. And obviously, the white political leaders couldn't have that. There was some trumped-up charges of violence. And by the end of the day, there were literally planes flying over Tulsa firebombing the black businesses and homes. That's the result of trying to be part of the American dream when you're not white in the 1860s. Or 80s, I guess, at this point. And well into the 1900s. This image here is in the book. Let's see. Yeah. It's by Horace Taylor, The Trust Giant's Point of View. What a funny little government, it says there. Where Rockefeller is treating the government as just another possession. He's got the White House there, inspecting it with a jeweler's loupe, seeing how much it's worth, while back here the Capitol building is just another part of his oil empire. So again, the folks back then were not blind to what was going on. This was not something that people figured out down the line. Like they were. It was pretty obvious what was going on. Also, speaking of which, and this one is from Puck, which is the other magazine we'll be seeing a lot of, along with Harper's Weekly. This is the protectors of our industries. So you have around here the various worker salaries, $9 a week, $11 a week, $7 a week, $6 a week, etc. And the workers down here, whereas at the top you have just a handful of people, Fields, Gould, Vanderbilt, and then of course, Rockefeller and Carnegie, that sort of thing. When the hard times hit, which is to say any kind of economic downturn, any kind of depression, anytime a railroad failed and it screwed up the whole economy, the only people who were hurt were the people at the bottom. They were the ones weathering it all, whereas the guys at the top were just fine. And I'll use a recent example. I don't know if you're aware, but during the COVID pandemic, I want to say the bottom like 70 to 80% of people, at least here in the U.S., I'm sure it was similar worldwide, but we have data here for the U.S., lost like collectively something like $600 billion just over, losing jobs and all of that. And then like the top 5% of people here in the United States gained about $600 billion. Like, weird that those numbers are real similar and happened during the same time period and seem to go from the bottom to the top. So this is still very much true, is when there's economic issues, the only people who suffer are the ones who are already suffering. Because the people at the top, they're safe. They're like, oh, well, we've got to weather it too. It's like, no, screw you guys. And also, again, just to bring it back to modern day, most of the government help during the COVID pandemic was like small business loans to help, the small businesses survive. And most of those ended up going to big businesses and corporations that didn't need it. And even some like individuals that were gaming the system. And I don't mean like, oh, welfare queens trying to get more than just like bread and milk with their, no, I'm talking about like individual people who are already millionaires who like claim to own a business and then will get this money from the government. So yeah, that's the sort of thing you see. As far back as the Gilded Age, and hadn't changed a whole lot. This one we'll talk more about next chapter, but the short version is Pullman owned a huge, it was called the Pullman Palace Car Company. They made train cars, but like really fancy train cars. And because of how big the facilities were, most of the workers lived on the site. There wasn't much commuting back then. So you were being paid by the same dude that you paid rent to, which already feels like a problem, but don't worry, it gets worse. So there was one of the many economic downturns of the 1800s, and it started cutting into Pullman's profits. So he did what many business owners did and cut the wages to his workers. So the people at the bottom who were already barely surviving were now making less while the economy's crashing. Cool. However, he kept the rent where it was. So you're being paid less by the guy who you pay rent to. And he controls the rent. It's not that there was somebody else, holding him hostage. He dropped the wages and kept the rent up, and the image here is, of course, squeezing every last coin out of his workers. Because oftentimes what would happen is when the economy would slump, because again, it happened like every 20, 30 years, and people started making less because they were just paid less per hour. Today, they get around that by just giving people less hours. And a lot of times the places where people lived would drop rent a little bit so that the people could still live there. It was never anything substantial, but like even from the landlord's point of view, you can either keep rent where it was and everybody has to leave because they can't afford it and you have an empty building, or you lower rent a little bit, the people can still live there, and you're making like slightly less money because you're still making a profit. None of these people were saints. Anyway, we'll get more into this next chapter. All right. So what these folks did for fun. Those that were extremely rich tended to build massive mansions, and oftentimes their secondary or vacation homes were just as expensive and expansive as their regular homes. A good example is Biltmore, which is constructed outside of Asheville, North Carolina. You may have been there because it's not that far from here. It was constructed by the Vanderbilts, and that was a summer home. That was just a vacation home. They didn't live there. 250 rooms, 40 master bedrooms, an indoor pool, an indoor bowling alley, and that's just inside the building. The grounds are huge. They've got their own vineyard. Yeah, it's the whole thing. And that was just where they went for vacation. Opera houses also became big. Let's see, both figuratively and literally. The Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Goulds, and Morgans financed the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City in 1883, which, considering it's all these big, rich families coming together to finance this thing, I'll show you just how expansive it is. I did also look it up last time. The Metropolitan Opera House that they built is no longer there. It was reconstructed and updated in the 60s. But the Met is still very much a thing in New York, and it was started by these guys. There were more white-collar workers. All these managerial jobs meant that there was at least something of a middle class. Now, while they, of course, couldn't afford secondary mansions to go hang out for part of the year, they did still have leisure activities, mass-produced furnishings, magazines, newspapers, various sorts of fiction, which was, as I always say when we get to this part, typically it was women that were doing the reading. It was the housewives who, they couldn't typically go out and work. They were pretty limited with that, but they were often the most well-read group in any era of history. They were the ones doing the reading. Also, we had these various organizations that came together to deal with the problems of industrialization because, again, from the 1800s, and I guess if you include Britain, the 1700s, as far back as we have evidence that humans existed as a culture, we've been farmers. You work the field from typically sun up to sundown, but it was your land and your field, and you worked as much as you needed to, which again, it wasn't easy work, but you get up in the morning, you would take care of usually the animals, and then you'd take a couple hours off during the middle of the day when it was hot, and then you'd go out in the afternoon and finish with the fields. And during winter, very little of that you needed to do anymore because you're waiting on spring to come back. So, for example, this is something I've seen several times on the internet now, and I can pretty much agree. Medieval peasants had more time off than we do today in the modern day because there were feast days and holidays, and you didn't really work during the winter because you couldn't farm. However, with industrialization, that all goes out the window. You work by a time clock. You come in, you punch in, and as some places, they'd lock the door behind you. You didn't leave until it was time to leave, which was great for when these places burned down, but we'll also get to that later. So these various organizations came together to try and ease people's suffering, for lack of a better term. American Red Cross, General Federation of Women's Club, American Historical Association, expansion of the YMCA. Things for people to do to relax their minds once they were done with work, because it broke a lot of people. And I mean, there is a historical argument of, like, we're still not entirely sure the full extent of the ramifications of the Industrial Revolution on the human psyche. It was such a drastic shift that was forced on so many people that it's hard to really grasp what all has resulted from it. Or to put it simply, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences. So, before I let you guys go, here are some images of Biltmore. Again, in case you've not been. Again, when I put this together, I was teaching upstate, so we were like an hour and a half from Biltmore at the time. So everyone up there had been to Biltmore. These big rooms. Here's the grounds. There's a greenhouse on the property, which is pretty neat. An old 1800s greenhouse. Library. There's the Opera House, which, again, having been built in the 1800s, is ridiculously large. And then just some magazine stuff from here in South Carolina. Some weird things. The one I always pick out is this lady race car driver, and it's titled, "She Laughs at Death." It's like, okay. That's a thing. Okay, we'll get more into other stuff. Today's Wednesday. Next week. And then we'll probably be finishing the chapter on Monday. So then we'll do the review, and then the test will be after that. So I'll put the PowerPoint up on Blackboard, and probably the study guide too, just so you guys will have it. But yeah, see y'all next week.